The Atlanta diner buzzed with activity on a busy evening. Chris, a young and ambitious waiter, moved confidently between tables, his demeanor exuding an air of superiority. He prided himself on his ability to identify and cater to what he considered VIP customers, those he deemed worthy of his attention based on appearance and perceived social status. As Chris efficiently attended to a table of well-dressed businessmen, a group of teenagers entered the diner. Among them was Amir, a young black man whose presence went unnoticed by the preoccupied waiter. The group settled into a booth, their animated chatter filling the air as they perused the menus. Minutes ticked by, and Amir's group remained unattended. Chris bustled past their table multiple times, his gaze sliding over them as if they were invisible. Amir's initial excitement about the outing with his friends began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of discomfort and frustration. Determined to get some service, Amir raised his hand, trying to catch Chris's attention. "Excuse me," he called out politely, but Chris continued on his path, focusing on a table of older patrons who had just been seated. Amir's friends exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and annoyance. One of them, a lanky boy named Mike, muttered, "What's this guy's problem? We've been here for ages." Amir shrugged, his posture deflating slightly. "Maybe he's just really busy," he offered, though his tone lacked conviction. As the minutes stretched on, Amir's attempts to flag down Chris grew more frequent and less subtle. Each time, Chris managed to look everywhere but at their table, his selective blindness becoming increasingly obvious. Unbeknownst to both Chris and Amir, a man seated at the counter had been observing the scene with growing concern. Mr. Davis, the owner of the diner, felt a knot forming in his stomach as he watched the interaction, or lack thereof, between his employee and his son. Mr. Davis had always tried to instill in Amir a sense of independence, encouraging him to make his own way in the world without relying on his father's influence. It was for this reason that he hadn't informed his staff about Amir's connection to him. Now, as he witnessed the blatant disregard Chris showed towards Amir and his friends, Mr. Davis found himself torn between his role as a father and his position as the owner. He watched as Chris deftly maneuvered around Amir's table, offering attentive service to other patrons while steadfastly ignoring the group of teenagers. The contrast in treatment was stark and undeniable. As the evening wore on, Mr. Davis's disappointment in Chris deepened. He had always prided himself on running an establishment that welcomed all customers equally. Seeing one of his employees engage in such discriminatory behavior shook him to his core. Yet, Mr. Davis held back from immediate intervention. He knew that addressing the situation required careful consideration. A hasty reaction could potentially worsen the situation or undermine Amir's ability to handle such encounters on his own. Instead, Mr. Davis began formulating a plan. He recognized that this incident presented an opportunity, not just to correct Chris's behavior, but to instigate a broader change within his diner. As he continued to observe, his mind raced with ideas for staff training, community outreach, and fostering a more inclusive environment. The evening drew to a close, with Amir and his friends eventually receiving minimal service from another waiter. As they left, their spirits dampened by the experience, Mr. Davis made a silent promise to address the issue, not just for Amir's sake, but for the sake of all his customers and the community at large. Outside the diner, Amir and his friends huddled together, their initial excitement from the evening replaced by a somber mood. The cool night air carried the weight of their shared frustration as they began to discuss what had transpired inside. "I can't believe that just happened," Mike said, his voice tinged with anger. "We should go back in there and give that waiter a piece of our mind." Amir shook his head, his expression a mix of resignation and disappointment. "It's not worth it, guys. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it probably won't be the last." The group fell silent for a moment, processing Amir's words. Sarah, another friend, spoke up. "But Amir, your dad owns the place. Can't you say something to him? He'd definitely do something about it." Amir sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "That's exactly why I don't want to say anything. I'm tired of living in my dad's shadow, you know. It's like I can't do anything without people thinking it's because of him." The conversation shifted as Amir opened up about his conflicted feelings. He explained how he appreciated his father's success, but often felt the weight of expectations it brought. "Sometimes I just want to be seen for who I am, not as Mr. Davis's son. But then stuff like this happens, and I'm reminded that maybe I need that connection to be treated fairly." As his friends listened, offering words of support and understanding, Amir grappled with the decision of whether to speak up or let the incident slide. The debate continued as they walked home, each friend offering a different perspective on how to handle the situation. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Mr. Davis had retreated to his office, his mind racing with thoughts of how to address the evening's events. He knew that simply reprimanding Chris wouldn't be enough. This called for a more comprehensive approach. Sitting at his desk, Mr. Davis began to outline a plan. He decided to organize a staff meeting to discuss the importance of respect and inclusion in customer service. But he wanted to go beyond just talk. He envisioned a series of workshops and training sessions that would help his employees understand the impact of their actions on customers from all walks of life. As he jotted down ideas, Mr. Davis couldn't help but think of Amir. He wondered if he had done the right thing by keeping his son's identity a secret from the staff. The intention had been to allow Amir to forge his own path, but had it inadvertently exposed him to discrimination? Mr. Davis resolved to have a conversation with Amir about the incident, but he was determined to approach it in a way that empowered his son rather than solving the problem for him. He wanted to provide Amir with the tools to navigate such situations, while also ensuring that his diner became a place where such incidents wouldn't happen in the first place. As the night wore on, Chris finished his shift, oblivious to the ripples his actions had caused. He counted his tips, satisfied with the night's earnings, and headed home without a second thought about the group of teenagers he had ignored. Little did Chris know that his world was about to be turned upside down. The coming days would challenge his perceptions, force him to confront his biases, and potentially reshape his entire outlook on life and work. Mr. Davis spent the next few days carefully planning his approach. He reached out to local community leaders and diversity experts, seeking advice on how to create a truly inclusive environment in his diner. He scheduled a series of meetings and workshops, determined to turn this negative experience into a catalyst for positive change. As the pieces of his plan fell into place, Mr. Davis felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He knew that the conversations ahead would be difficult and potentially uncomfortable for some of his staff, but he also believed in the potential for growth and transformation that lay ahead. The stage was set for a series of events that would not only address the incident with Amir, but also spark a broader dialogue about respect, inclusion, and the role of small businesses in fostering community harmony. As Mr. Davis finalized the details of his plan, he couldn't help but wonder how Chris would react to the upcoming changes and whether this experience would lead to a genuine transformation in the young waiter's attitude and behavior. The atmosphere in the diner was tense as Mr. Davis gathered his staff for the meeting. Chris, along with the other employees, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to expect. Mr. Davis stood at the front of the room, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by a serious expression. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Davis began, his voice steady and firm. "We need to have an important discussion about how we treat our customers. Every person who walks through that door deserves respect and excellent service, regardless of their appearance, age, or background." As Mr. Davis spoke about the importance of inclusivity and respect, Chris listened with a mix of confusion and defensiveness. He prided himself on being a good waiter and couldn't understand why this meeting was necessary. Surely, he thought, this couldn't be about him. Mr. Davis continued, sharing stories of customers who had felt unwelcome or discriminated against. He didn't mention any specific incidents, but his gaze occasionally lingered on Chris, making the young waiter increasingly uneasy. "We're not just a business," Mr. Davis emphasized. "We're a part of this community. Our actions have the power to make people feel valued or invisible. I want us to be known as a place where everyone feels welcome." As the meeting progressed, Chris found himself reflecting on his own behavior. He had always justified his actions as good business sense, focusing on customers he thought would leave better tips. But now, hearing Mr. Davis speak, he began to question his assumptions. After the meeting, Mr. Davis announced that he would be organizing a series of workshops on diversity and inclusion. He introduced the first speaker, a young man named Amir, who Chris vaguely recognized as one of the teenagers from the other night. Amir stood before the group, visibly nervous, but determined. "I'm here to share my experiences," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Not just as a customer, but as someone who's grown up watching this diner evolve. As Amir shared his story, detailing instances of feeling overlooked or judged based on his appearance, Chris felt a growing sense of discomfort. He realized that some of Amir's experiences mirrored the very behavior he had exhibited. Amir spoke about the challenges of being the owner's son, a fact that took many of the staff by surprise. "I've often felt like I'm living in my father's shadow," Amir admitted. "I want to be seen for who I am, not just as Mr. Davis's son. But that doesn't mean I should be invisible or treated with disrespect." The room fell silent as Amir's words sank in. Many of the staff members, including Chris, began to see their young colleague in a new light. They had never considered how their actions might impact someone like Amir, who straddled the line between privilege and discrimination. As Amir concluded his speech, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. There was a palpable sense of reflection and, in some cases, remorse. Mr. Davis thanked Amir for his bravery in sharing his experiences and encouraged the staff to reflect on what they had heard. Chris, in particular, felt a whirlwind of emotions. He was shocked to learn that Amir was Mr. Davis's son, embarrassed by his own behavior, and confused about how to move forward. He had always seen himself as a fair person, but Amir's words forced him to confront the biases he had never acknowledged. As the workshop concluded, Mr. Davis announced that this was just the beginning. He outlined plans for ongoing training and discussions, emphasizing that creating an inclusive environment was a continuous process, not a one-time effort. The staff dispersed, many engaged in quiet conversations about what they had learned. Chris lingered behind, watching as some of his colleagues approached Amir to thank him for his honesty. He felt an urge to do the same but held back, unsure of how to bridge the gap he had created with his actions. As Chris left the diner that day, he knew that things would never be the same. The comfortable assumptions he had relied on had been shaken, and he was left grappling with the realization that his actions had real, sometimes hurtful, consequences for others. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain: change was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. In the days following the workshop, Chris found himself in a state of internal turmoil. The revelations from Amir's speech had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront aspects of his behavior he had long ignored or justified. As he went about his shifts at the diner, he caught himself scrutinizing his own actions, second-guessing interactions that he would have previously thought nothing of. One slow afternoon, Chris found himself alone at the counter, absently wiping down the already clean surface. His mind wandered back to Amir's words, replaying the hurt and frustration in the young man's voice. The guilt that had been gnawing at him since the workshop suddenly felt overwhelming. Lost in thought, Chris didn't notice Amir enter the diner until he was standing right in front of him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words and lingering tension. Amir broke the silence first. "Hey," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "Can we talk for a minute?" Chris hesitated, surprise and anxiety battling within him. Part of him wanted to make an excuse, to avoid the conversation he knew would be difficult. But a larger part, the part that had been grappling with his conscience since the workshop, knew this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. "Sure," Chris replied, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. "Let's sit down." They moved to a quiet booth in the corner of the diner. As they settled in, Chris found himself at a loss for words. How could he possibly address what had happened? How could he explain actions that he himself was only beginning to understand? Amir, sensing Chris's discomfort, took the lead. "I wanted to thank you for listening during the workshop," he began. "I know it couldn't have been easy to hear." Chris nodded, grateful for the opening. "It wasn't," he admitted, "but I'm glad I did. I've been doing a lot of thinking since then." As they talked, Chris found himself opening up about his own background, growing up in a struggling family, the pressure he felt to succeed, and how that had shaped his views on work and customer service. He tried to explain, without excusing, the mindset that had led him to prioritize certain customers over others. "I thought I was just being smart about my job," Chris said, his voice tinged with regret. "I never stopped to think about how it might make people feel." Amir listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When Chris finished speaking, Amir leaned forward, his gaze direct. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, "but you need to understand that intentions don't negate impact. Your actions hurt people, whether you meant them to or not." Chris felt a flash of defensiveness, but he forced himself to really hear Amir's words. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I can see that now. I don't know how to make it right." Amir's expression softened slightly. "Recognizing the problem is the first step," he said, "but it can't stop there. You need to actively work on changing your behavior, on challenging your assumptions about people." As their conversation continued, Chris found himself asking questions he'd never considered before. He listened as Amir shared more about his experiences, not just at the diner, but in his daily life. With each story, Chris felt his perspective shifting, his understanding deepening. By the time their talk came to an end, Chris felt both drained and oddly energized. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he had a clearer path forward. As Amir stood to leave, Chris called out to him. "Amir," he said, his voice sincere, "thank you for giving me a chance to listen, to understand. I know I messed up, but I want to do better." Amir nodded, a small smile on his face. "That's all any of us can do," he said. "Keep trying to be better." As Chris watched Amir leave the diner, he felt a mix of emotions: shame for his past actions, gratitude for the opportunity to learn, and a newfound determination to change. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that he would likely make mistakes along the way. But he was committed to the journey, to becoming not just a better waiter, but a better person. With a deep breath, Chris turned back to his work, his mind already racing with ideas on how he could start making positive changes in his interactions with customers. The conversation with Amir had been a turning point, and Chris was determined not to let this opportunity for growth slip away. In the weeks that followed his conversation with Amir, Chris threw himself into changing his approach at work. Every shift became an opportunity to put his newfound awareness into practice. He made a conscious effort to greet each customer with the same level of enthusiasm and respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. At first, the change felt awkward and forced. Chris found himself second-guessing every interaction, worried about inadvertently offending someone. But as the days passed, He began to notice a shift, not just in his own behavior, but in the overall atmosphere of the diner. Customers who had previously seemed withdrawn or hesitant now engaged more freely with Chris. He started to recognize regulars he had once overlooked, learning their names and preferences. The genuine connections he was forming brought a new sense of satisfaction to his work. From his usual spot at the counter, Mr. Davis observed these changes with quiet approval. He noticed how Chris now took the time to chat with the elderly couple who came in for coffee every morning, and how he went out of his way to make the group of teenagers who frequented the diner feel welcome. Amir, too, had been watching Chris's transformation. While still cautious, he couldn't help but be impressed by the waiter's efforts. One afternoon, as Chris was setting up for the dinner rush, Amir approached him. "Hey, Chris," Amir said, a hint of a smile on his face. "I've noticed the changes you've been making. It's good to see." Chris felt a surge of pride at Amir's words. "Thanks," he replied, genuinely grateful for the acknowledgement. "I'm trying. It's not always easy, but I'm learning a lot." Their conversation was interrupted by Mr. Davis, who called them both over. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes twinkling with excitement, "about hosting a community event here at the diner. Something to bring people together, to celebrate our diversity. I'd like you both to help organize it." Chris and Amir exchanged surprised glances. The idea of working together on such a project seemed both exciting and daunting. "That sounds great, Dad," Amir said, his enthusiasm evident. "What did you have in mind?" As Mr. Davis outlined his vision for a multicultural food festival that would showcase dishes from various communities in Atlanta, Chris found himself getting caught up in the excitement. He began to suggest ideas for decorations and entertainment, his natural flair for customer service shining through in a new context. Over the next few weeks, Chris and Amir worked side by side to bring the event to life. They reached out to local community groups, coordinated with vendors, and planned the logistics of transforming the diner into a vibrant festival space. Through their collaboration, a tentative friendship began to form. They discovered shared interests in music and sports, and Chris found himself genuinely enjoying Amir's company. The lingering awkwardness from their past interactions gradually faded, replaced by a growing mutual respect. The day of the event arrived, and the diner buzzed with activity. The usual booths and tables had been rearranged to accommodate food stalls representing cuisines from around the world. Colorful decorations adorned the walls, and the air was filled with the tantalizing aromas of diverse dishes. As customers poured in, Chris and Amir worked in tandem to ensure everything ran smoothly. Chris marveled at how natural it felt to interact with such a diverse crowd, realizing how much he had grown in just a few short weeks. During a lull in the festivities, Chris found himself sharing his story with a group of curious attendees. He spoke candidly about his past biases and the journey he had undertaken to change. As he talked, he caught Amir's eye across the room. Amir gave him a nod of encouragement, and Chris felt a warm sense of accomplishment. The event was a resounding success, drawing praise from attendees and local media alike. As they cleaned up at the end of the night, exhausted but exhilarated, Mr. Davis gathered his team. "I'm proud of all of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what community looks like. This is the kind of place I've always wanted our diner to be." As Chris headed home that night, he felt a profound sense of change. The diner, which had once been just a job to him, now felt like a second home. He had discovered a passion for bringing people together, for making everyone feel welcome. And in the process, he had found a new version of himself, one he was truly proud to be. As the weeks turned into months, the positive changes at the diner continued to ripple outward. Word spread about the inclusive atmosphere and the diverse events hosted there, attracting a wider range of customers from all corners of Atlanta. The once quiet establishment was now often bustling with a mix of regulars and newcomers, all drawn by the welcoming environment that Chris, Amir, and the rest of the staff had worked hard to create. Chris found himself thriving in this new atmosphere. He took pride in knowing the names and preferences of a diverse array of regular customers, and he enjoyed the challenge of making newcomers feel instantly at home. His natural charm, once reserved for a select few, now extended to everyone who walked through the door. One busy Saturday morning, as Chris expertly navigated the crowded diner, balancing plates and chatting easily with customers, he caught sight of a familiar face entering the restaurant. It was Sarah, an old friend from high school, who had recently started working part-time at the diner. Chris greeted her with a warm smile, but something in her expression made him pause. As the morning rush died down, Sarah approached Chris, her manner hesitant. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her voice low. They stepped into a quiet corner, and Sarah took a deep breath before speaking. "Chris, I've been meaning to talk to you about something," she began. I saw you that night, a few months ago, when you were ignoring that group of teenagers. One of them was Mr. Davis's son, wasn't it?" Chris felt his stomach drop. The memory of that night, which he had worked so hard to make amends for, came rushing back. But Sarah wasn't finished. "I know you've changed, Chris. Anyone can see that. But, well, there are some people who are talking about what happened. They're saying maybe your change isn't genuine, that you're just trying to save face." Chris listened, a mix of emotions washing over him. He felt a flash of anger at the idea that his efforts were being questioned, followed quickly by a wave of shame as he remembered his past behavior. But underneath it all was a steadfast determination. He knew who he was now, and he wasn't about to let his past define him. "Thank you for telling me, Sarah," Chris said, his voice calm despite the turmoil he felt inside. "I can't change what I did that night. It was wrong, and I'm not proud of it. But I can control who I am now and who I'm going to be going forward." Sarah nodded, seeming relieved by his response. "I just thought you should know," she said. "For what it's worth, I think the change in you is real. I've seen it every day." As Sarah walked away, Chris took a moment to collect himself. The threat of his past actions coming to light loomed over him, but he refused to let it derail the progress he had made. Instead, he channeled his energy into his work, determined to prove through his actions that his change was genuine and lasting. Over the next few days, Chris threw himself into his job with renewed vigor. He went above and beyond for every customer, organized a spontaneous celebration for a regular's birthday, and even stayed late to help a new employee learn the ropes. Each interaction was an opportunity to reinforce the person he had become. One evening, as Chris was closing up the diner, he found Mr. Davis waiting for him. "Walk with me, Chris," the older man said, his tone serious but not unkind. As they strolled through the quiet streets, Mr. Davis spoke. "I've heard some rumblings about your past behavior," he said. Chris felt his heart rate quicken, but Mr. Davis continued. "But I've also seen who you are now. People can change, Chris. I believe that. The question is, do you believe it about yourself?" Chris took a moment to consider his words carefully. "I do, Mr. Davis," he said finally. "I'm not the same person I was back then. I've learned, I've grown, and I'm committed to continuing that growth. If my past comes to light, I'll face it honestly, but I won't let it define me or undo all the work I've done." Mr. Davis nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's what I wanted to hear," he said. "Keep doing what you're doing, Chris. Actions speak louder than words, and your actions these past months have spoken volumes." As they parted ways, Chris felt a renewed sense of purpose. The shadow of his past actions still loomed, but he was no longer afraid of it. He knew that the true test of his character would be in how he faced this challenge, and he was determined to meet it head-on. As the diner continued to flourish under its new inclusive atmosphere, Chris found himself facing an unexpected opportunity. One morning, Mr. Davis approached him with an intriguing proposition. "Chris," Mr. Davis began, his eyes twinkling with excitement, "Amir has been invited to speak at the local high school about inclusivity and respect in the workplace. I think it would be great if you could go with him. Your journey could be a powerful example for these young people." Chris felt a mix of emotions at the suggestion: pride at being considered for such an important task, nervousness about speaking in public, and a lingering concern about his past being exposed. However, the thought of supporting Amir and potentially making a positive impact on young minds outweighed his apprehensions. "I'd be honored, Mr. Davis," Chris replied, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "Thank you for trusting me with this." Over the next few weeks, Chris and Amir spent their free time preparing for the presentation. What started as awkward planning sessions soon evolved into engaging discussions and even friendly debates. They shared personal stories, brainstormed ideas, and challenged each other's perspectives. Through this process, their tentative friendship deepened into a genuine bond. The day of the presentation arrived, and Chris found himself standing backstage at the school auditorium, his heart racing. Amir, noticing his friend's nervousness, gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "You've got this, Chris," Amir said with a smile. "Just speak from the heart. Your story is powerful." As Amir took the stage to begin their presentation, Chris watched from the wings, amazed at how confidently his friend addressed the sea of teenage faces. Amir spoke eloquently about the importance of inclusivity and the impact of small actions on creating a welcoming environment. Then, it was Chris's turn. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the stage. Looking out at the audience, he was struck by their diversity, a visual reminder of why this message was so important. "A few months ago," Chris began, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I wouldn't have believed I'd be standing here today. I was the guy who judged people based on their appearance, who thought some customers were more valuable than others." As Chris shared his story, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned, and the ongoing journey of growth he was on, he saw the students lean in, their expressions changing from mild interest to engaged curiosity. He spoke about the power of second chances, the importance of acknowledging one's mistakes, and the transformative impact of truly seeing and valuing every individual. "Change isn't easy," Chris concluded, "and it's not always comfortable, but it's worth it, not just for the people around you, but for yourself. I'm a better person today because I chose to change, and I continue to choose that every day." As Chris stepped back, the auditorium erupted in applause. He saw students nodding, some wiping away tears, others turning to their friends in animated discussion. The impact of their words was palpable. During the Q&A session that followed, Chris was struck by the thoughtful questions from the students. They asked about handling peer pressure, strategies for promoting inclusivity in their own lives, and how to address their own biases. Chris found himself answering with a confidence he didn't know he possessed, drawing from his experiences to offer genuine, practical advice. As they left the school, both Chris and Amir were buzzing with energy. "That was incredible," Amir said, grinning widely. "Did you see how engaged they were? I think we really made an impact." Chris nodded, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. "It felt good to share my story," he admitted. "If it helps even one of those kids think differently about how they treat others, it's worth it." Inspired by the positive response, Chris suggested they create a short video about the diner's journey towards inclusivity. Amir enthusiastically agreed, and they spent the next few days planning and filming. The video featured interviews with staff and regular customers, showcasing the diverse community that had formed around the diner. As they edited the final cut, Chris couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. From a waiter who judged customers based on appearance to someone advocating for inclusivity on camera. The transformation was remarkable. Yet, he knew this was just another step in his ongoing journey of growth and learning. The video, once completed, was shared on the diner's social media accounts. To everyone's surprise, it quickly gained traction, attracting attention beyond their local community. Comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences and praising the diner's initiative. As Chris watched the video's view count climb, he felt a mix of pride and humility. He was proud of the changes he'd made and the positive impact he was having, but he also recognized that this journey was far from over. There was still so much to learn, so many ways to grow. But for the first time, he felt truly excited about the path ahead. The unexpected viral success of the video catapulted the diner into the local spotlight. What had started as a simple project to showcase their journey towards inclusivity had become a beacon of hope and change for the community. Local news stations began reaching out, eager to feature the diner's story. One sunny morning, as Chris was setting up for the day, he noticed a small news crew entering the diner. His heart raced as he recognized the reporter from the local TV station. Mr. Davis greeted them warmly and, to Chris's surprise, invited him to join the interview. "Chris here has been instrumental in our transformation," Mr. Davis said, clapping Chris on the shoulder. "I think his perspective would be valuable for your story." As the cameras rolled, Chris found himself sharing the diner's journey, carefully omitting the specifics of his past behavior. He spoke about the community events, the diverse clientele, and the sense of belonging that now permeated the establishment. The words flowed easily, fueled by his genuine passion for the changes they'd made. "It's not just about serving food anymore," Chris said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "It's about creating a space where everyone feels welcome, where connections are made across all sorts of boundaries." The interview went smoothly, and Chris felt a sense of relief as the crew packed up their equipment. However, that relief was short-lived. As he turned to head back to work, he noticed Amir standing nearby, a concerned look on his face. "Chris, we need to talk," Amir said quietly, leading him to a quiet corner of the diner. "Some journalists have been asking questions about the incident that sparked all these changes. They're digging into the story behind our transformation." Chris felt his stomach drop. The specter of his past mistakes, which had been lurking in the background, now threatened to come to the forefront. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amir shook his head. "I'm not sure. Dad's trying to keep things under wraps, but you know how persistent reporters can be. I thought you should know." As the day progressed, Chris found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his work. The threat of exposure hung over him like a dark cloud. He caught himself checking his phone obsessively, half expecting to see his past mistakes splashed across the local news websites. During a lull in the afternoon, Chris retreated to the back office, needing a moment to collect his thoughts. He was surprised to find Mr. Davis there, looking equally troubled. "Chris," Mr. Davis began, his tone serious. "I've been thinking about this situation. The reporters are going to find out eventually. Maybe it's better if we control the narrative." Chris felt a mix of fear and relief at Mr. Davis's words. The thought of voluntarily exposing his past mistakes was terrifying, but the idea of taking control of the situation was appealing. "What do you mean?" Chris asked, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. Mr. Davis leaned forward, his eyes kind but determined. "I think we should consider telling our full story. Not just the feel-good parts, but the difficult journey too. Your transformation, Chris. That's the real story here. It shows that change is possible, that people can learn and grow." As they discussed the possibilities, Chris felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The idea of facing his past head-on, of owning his mistakes and showcasing his growth, was both frightening and liberating. By the end of their conversation, a plan had formed. They would reach out to a respected local journalist and offer an exclusive, in-depth look at the diner's journey, including the uncomfortable truths that had sparked their transformation. As Chris left the office, he caught sight of his reflection in a mirror. The face looking back at him was no longer that of a young man hiding from his past, but of someone ready to face the future, mistakes and all. That night, as he lay in bed, Chris thought about the potential consequences of their decision. He knew that not everyone would understand or accept his change. There might be backlash, lost customers, or damaged relationships. But he also felt, for the first time, truly at peace with himself. Whatever came next, he would face it with honesty and integrity. As he drifted off to sleep, Chris found himself looking forward to the next chapter in their story. The diner had become more than just a workplace. It was a symbol of transformation, a testament to the power of change. And he, Chris realized with a mixture of humility and pride, had become an integral part of that symbol. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as Chris, Amir, and Mr. Davis prepared for the in-depth interview that would reveal the full story of the diner's transformation. They spent hours discussing how to approach the sensitive topics, particularly Chris's past behavior. The atmosphere was tense but determined, with everyone understanding the gravity of what they were about to do. On the morning of the interview, Chris arrived at the diner early, his stomach in knots. As he helped set up the space where they would talk with the journalist, he couldn't help but replay worst-case scenarios in his mind. What if people couldn't forgive his past actions? What if this destroyed everything they had built? Amir, noticing Chris's nervousness, pulled him aside. "Hey," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Whatever happens today, we're in this together. Remember, it's not just about exposing past mistakes. It's about showing how people can change for the better." Chris nodded, grateful for Amir's support. As they waited for the journalist to arrive, he took deep breaths, reminding himself of how far he'd come and why this story needed to be told. The interview began, and as they delved into the diner's history, Chris found himself speaking with a candor that surprised even him. He recounted the night he had ignored Amir and his friends, not sparing himself as he described his prejudiced thoughts and actions. His voice shook slightly as he spoke, but he pushed through, determined to own up to his past. "I'm not proud of who I was that night," Chris said, looking directly at the journalist. "But I'm grateful for the wake-up call it provided. It forced me to confront my biases and really examine why I acted the way I did." As the interview progressed, they discussed the changes implemented at the diner, the community events, and the personal growth experienced by the staff. Chris spoke about the challenges of changing ingrained behaviors and the ongoing process of educating himself about diversity and inclusion. Towards the end of the interview, the journalist asked a pointed question. "Chris, do you think you deserve forgiveness for your past actions?" The room fell silent. Chris took a moment to consider his response. "I don't think forgiveness is something you can demand or expect," he said slowly. "What I did was wrong, and I understand if some people can't forgive that. What I hope is that my actions since then speak louder than my past mistake. I'm committed to continuing this journey of growth and using my experience to help others recognize and address their own biases." As the journalist packed up her equipment, Chris felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. They had laid everything bare, for better or worse. Now, all they could do was wait for the story to break. The next few days were tense. Chris found himself constantly checking news sites and social media, bracing for the public's reaction. When the article finally went live, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in, ranging from praise for their honesty to harsh criticism of Chris's past actions. Some lauded the diner as an example of positive change, while others questioned the sincerity of their transformation. The local community buzzed with discussions about the story, and Chris found himself at the center of a fierce debate about redemption and second chances. Amidst the chaos, Chris received an unexpected message. It was from Sarah, his old friend who had initially warned him about the rumors. "I just read the article," her message read. "It took a lot of courage to share your story like that. I'm proud of you, Chris." Her words provided a small comfort, but as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. Some regular customers stopped coming to the diner, uncomfortable with the revelations about Chris's past. Others made a point of showing their support, going out of their way to engage with Chris and commend his honesty. The situation came to a head when a small group of protesters gathered outside the diner one morning, carrying signs condemning Chris and calling for his firing. As Chris watched them from inside, he felt a wave of despair. Had their decision to tell the truth been a mistake? Mr. Davis, seeing Chris's distress, approached him. "Chris," he said firmly, "we knew this wouldn't be easy, but we also knew it was the right thing to do. Stand tall. Your actions since that night speak volumes about who you are now." As Chris nodded, trying to draw strength from Mr. Davis's words, Amir burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Guys," he exclaimed, "you need to see this. Something's happening outside." Confused and apprehensive, Chris and Mr. Davis followed Amir to the front of the diner. What they saw left them speechless. A crowd had gathered, far larger than the group of protesters. But these people weren't there to condemn. They were customers, community members, and even some faces Chris recognized from their school presentation. And they were there to show their support. As Chris stood there, taking in the scene, he realized that this was the true test of their journey. It wasn't just about personal growth or changing one diner. It was about sparking a larger conversation, about showing that change was possible, and that facing the truth, however uncomfortable, was the first step towards real transformation. With a deep breath, Chris stepped outside to face the crowd, ready to listen, to learn, and to continue the difficult but necessary work of making their community a more inclusive place for everyone. As Chris stepped outside to face the crowd, he was immediately overwhelmed by the mix of emotions on display. Some faces showed support and encouragement, while others reflected skepticism and even anger. The air was thick with tension, but there was also an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that something significant was about to unfold. Taking a deep breath, Chris raised his hands to quiet the murmuring crowd. "I know many of you are here because of the recent article," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I want to thank you all for coming, whether you're here to support us or to voice your concerns. I'm here to listen and to talk." As Chris spoke, he noticed his former friend and co-worker, the one who had threatened to expose his past, standing at the edge of the crowd. Their eyes met briefly, and Chris saw a flicker of surprise in her expression. "I made mistakes," Chris continued, addressing not just the crowd, but his former friend as well. "Serious mistakes that hurt people. I'm not here to make excuses or to ask for easy forgiveness. I'm here because I believe in the power of change, and I want to be part of making our community better." As Chris shared more about his journey, the atmosphere began to shift. People who had come ready to argue found themselves listening intently. Even some of the protesters lowered their signs, drawn in by the raw honesty of Chris's words. Encouraged by the response, Chris decided to take a risk. "I'd like to open the floor to anyone who wants to share their thoughts or experiences. This isn't just about me or the diner. It's about all of us and the community we want to build." What followed was a powerful and sometimes heated dialogue. Community members stepped forward to share their own experiences of discrimination, both as victims and, in some cases, as perpetrators who had learned to change. Others expressed their struggles with forgiveness and their fears about ingrained biases. Throughout it all, Chris listened more than he spoke. He acknowledged the pain his past actions had caused and committed to continuing his journey of growth and education. When challenged, he didn't become defensive, but instead thanked people for their honesty and asked how he could do better. As the impromptu community forum continued, Chris noticed Mr. Davis and Amir moving through the crowd, engaging in one-on-one conversations and offering support where needed. Their presence and involvement underscored that this was truly a team effort, a commitment from the entire diner to be a force for positive change. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, the crowd had thinned, but the energy remained high. People were exchanging contact information, making plans for follow-up discussions and community initiatives. What had started as a potential crisis had transformed into a catalyst for broader community engagement. As the last of the crowd dispersed, Chris's former friend approached him. Her expression was a mix of emotions: regret, admiration, and something like hope. "I didn't expect this," she said softly. "When I threatened to expose you, I thought I was doing the right thing. But seeing all this," she gestured to the lingering groups of people still deep in conversation, "I realize there's more to the story. I'm sorry, Chris. And I'm proud of how you've handled this." Chris felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Your threat, it was scary at the time, but it pushed me to confront this head on. In a way, you helped make this happen." As they talked, Mr. Davis approached with a group of community leaders who had been present for the discussions. "Chris," he said, his voice filled with pride, "these folks have some ideas they want to discuss with us. They think our diner could be a model for other businesses in promoting inclusivity and community dialogue." The next few hours were a whirlwind of brainstorming and planning. The diner was transformed once again, this time into a makeshift community center. Ideas flowed freely: regular community forums, training programs for local businesses, youth mentorship initiatives. Chris found himself at the center of it all, his past mistake now serving as a powerful testament to the possibility of change. As the night wound down and the last of the visitors left, Chris, Amir, and Mr. Davis stood together in the quiet diner. The events of the day had left them exhausted, but invigorated. "I never imagined it would turn out like this," Chris said, shaking his head in wonder. Amir grinned, throwing an arm around Chris's shoulders. "That's the thing about honest conversations. You never know where they'll lead, but I'd say this is a pretty good start." Mr. Davis nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "You've done good, Chris. Both of you have. This diner has always been about bringing people together over good food. Now, it's bringing them together for something even more important." As they locked up for the night, Chris took one last look around the diner. The place that had once been just a job, then a source of shame, had become something he never could have imagined, a symbol of transformation and a catalyst for community change. Walking home under the starlit sky, Chris felt a profound sense of peace. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be more difficult conversations, more challenges to overcome. But for the first time, he felt truly equipped to face them. He had found his purpose, not in hiding from his past, but in using it to create a better future, for himself, for the diner, and for his community. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Chris's last thoughts were not of fear or regret, but of hope and determination. Tomorrow was a new day, another opportunity to learn, to grow, and to make a difference. And he was ready for it, one conversation, one customer, one community member at a time.